I think it's very important that tradition stays, and tradition has a huge part of all this. But there's also points where you look at tradition and go, is that still fit for purpose today? Is that still the right thing to do? Are we still doing and having the most impact we could be having?
Within the last 48 hours, inside Windsor Castle, a quiet but decisive shift has begun to reshape the balance of power within the British monarchy. Prince William is no longer waiting for the crown, he is positioning himself as its protector, and at the center of this unfolding tension stands Queen Camilla. The story does not begin with confrontation, and it certainly does not begin with headlines. It begins with a moment that, at first glance, appeared ceremonial. A state banquet, diplomatic in purpose, rich in tradition, and carefully staged to project continuity. But inside Windsor Castle, beneath the formal structure of royal protocol, something far more consequential was unfolding, something that would quietly transform the relationship between Prince William and Queen Camilla from uneasy coexistence into strategic opposition. The date was March 18, 2026, and the occasion carried significant diplomatic weight. The United Kingdom was hosting Bola Tinubu for Nigeria's first state visit in nearly 4 decades, a moment designed to reinforce international partnerships and showcase the enduring relevance of the crown in global affairs. Every detail of the event had been calibrated to precision, from the guest list to the ceremonial order, from the visual symbolism to the messaging that would be projected across international media. But for William, the focus was not on optics. It was on condition. Because as the evening unfolded, one detail became impossible for him to ignore. King Charles III did not look like a man who should have been standing through hours of formal engagement. The fatigue was visible, not exaggerated, not dramatized, but present in a way that could not be dismissed by those who knew what to look for. And for William, who had been closely monitoring his father's health following a cancer diagnosis, that visibility crossed a threshold. What makes this moment critical is not simply William's concern. It is how that concern translated into perception. Because in his view, this was not an unavoidable obligation imposed by state necessity. It was a decision. A decision to proceed, to maintain appearances, to prioritize continuity over caution. And in the structure of the royal household, decisions of that magnitude are never made in isolation. The question, then, was not whether Charles should have attended. The question was, who ensured that he did? And increasingly, within internal discussions and private reflections, William's focus turned toward Queen Camilla. Now, to understand why this mattered, you have to look beyond the event itself and into the pattern that had been forming in the months leading up to it. This was not the first time William had raised concerns about his father's workload. Nor was it the first time those concerns had encountered resistance. What had changed was the context. Health was no longer theoretical, and the consequences of overextension were no longer abstract. Camilla's position, however, operated on a different logic. From her perspective, visibility was not optional, it was essential. A monarch seen as inactive risks being perceived as diminished, and in an institution where perception directly affects legitimacy, that risk cannot be ignored. Encouraging Charles to remain engaged, to maintain a presence, to fulfill duties despite personal strain, could be interpreted not as disregard, but as preservation. This is where the conflict deepens, because both perspectives carry internal logic, but they lead to opposing outcomes. For William, protecting the monarchy begins with protecting the man who represents it. For Camilla, protecting the monarchy requires maintaining the image that sustains it. And on the night of that state banquet, those two interpretations collided. What followed was not immediate confrontation, but escalation through accumulation. Observations turned into conversations, conversations into disagreements, and disagreements into a pattern of unresolved tension that began to shape how decisions were interpreted within the palace environment. According to individuals familiar with the internal atmosphere, William's frustration was not explosive, it was controlled, but intensifying. Because from his vantage point, every instance where Charles appeared to be pushed beyond his limits reinforced a single conclusion. Influence was being exercised in a direction he fundamentally disagreed with. And that is the moment where concern transforms into opposition. This shift becomes even more significant when placed against the broader backdrop of William's personal history. The loss of Princess Diana was not just a defining emotional event. It was a reference point that continues to inform how he interprets risk, responsibility, and the consequences of institutional pressure. The idea that public duty could come at the expense of personal well-being is not theoretical to him. It is lived experience. So when he observes his father, already facing serious illness, Continuing to operate under an intense public schedule, the situation does not register as routine. It registers as repetition. And in that emotional context, the role of Camilla is not neutral. She becomes, in William's perception, the factor that stands between adjustment and continuation. This is where the narrative moves from disagreement into strategy. Because William does not operate impulsively. His approach, as observed over recent years, is measured, deliberate, and increasingly assertive when it comes to defining the future structure of the monarchy. What began as private concern now began to take on a more defined shape, one that extended beyond immediate scheduling decisions into broader questions of influence, alignment, and long-term positioning. At the center of this evolving strategy was a clear objective: reduce variables that could destabilize the institution during a period of vulnerability. And within that framework, Camilla's network, her relationships, her associations, her extended circle, began to be viewed not just as social connections, but as factors within a larger system of influence. This is where the reported ultimatum enters the picture. According to sources referenced in the unfolding narrative, William drew a line, not publicly, not through official channels, but internally, regarding associations that he believed posed reputational risk to the monarchy. The focus of this line extended toward figures connected to past controversies, particularly those linked to Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. From William's perspective, the monarchy was entering a phase where tolerance for reputational ambiguity had effectively disappeared. Every association would be scrutinized, every connection evaluated, and every potential liability addressed before it could evolve into public damage. Camilla, however, did not operate within that same framework. Her long-standing relationship with Sarah Ferguson predated many of the controversies that now surround the York Circle. It was personal, not strategic. And from her point of view, abandoning that relationship under pressure would not represent strength, it would represent capitulation. This is where the disagreement escalates into a structural conflict. Because William's position is rooted in future control, in shaping a monarchy that is streamlined, disciplined, and insulated from reputational risk. Camilla's position is rooted in continuity, in maintaining relationships that have survived decades of turbulence and are not easily redefined by shifting narratives. And when those two positions collide, compromise becomes increasingly difficult. The critical point here is not the ultimatum itself, but what it represents. It signals that William is no longer operating solely within the boundaries of his current role. He is acting in anticipation of his future authority. This is a subtle but significant shift, because it introduces a dynamic where decisions are influenced not just by the present hierarchy, but by the emerging one. And within Buckingham Palace, that kind of dual-layer authority creates tension that cannot be easily resolved through protocol alone. As this dynamic continues to unfold, the atmosphere within Windsor Castle reflects more than just a family disagreement. It reflects a system adjusting to an accelerated transition, one where the future is beginning to assert itself before it has been formally declared. And at the center of that adjustment stands a single, unresolved question. Not whether change is coming, but whether those who are part of the current structure are willing, or able, to adapt to the version of the monarchy that Prince William is already beginning to build. What followed that initial rupture at Windsor Castle did not unfold in the open, and it certainly did not resolve itself through simple disagreement. Instead, it deepened, quietly, structurally, and with a level of precision that signaled something far more consequential than a family dispute. Because once Prince William crossed the line from concern into intervention, the situation was no longer about a single event. It became about control. Who exercises it, who influences it, and who ultimately defines the direction of the monarchy during a moment of vulnerability. In the days following the state banquet, the internal atmosphere began to shift in ways that were subtle on the surface but unmistakable beneath it. Conversations that had once been informal became structured. Access that had once been fluid became selective. And most importantly, the tone of decision-making began to change. Not dramatically, not publicly, but with enough consistency that those operating within the palace environment understood that a new dynamic was taking hold. At the center of this shift was Prince William, whose approach moved from observation to coordination. What is critical to understand is that William did not attempt to challenge authority directly. That would have been ineffective, and more importantly, destabilizing. Instead, he began to operate within the system, but with a different level of intent, aligning advisors, shaping discussions, and gradually influencing the framework through which decisions were being made. This is how power transitions begin in institutions like the British monarchy, not through declarations, but through alignment. And as that alignment strengthened, one reality became increasingly clear. William's priority was no longer limited to protecting his father in isolated instances. It had expanded into something broader, a strategic effort to ensure that King Charles III was not placed in situations that could accelerate physical strain or create visible vulnerability. Because from William's perspective, the stakes were no longer personal. They were institutional. Every public appearance, every diplomatic engagement, every extended schedule now carried a dual meaning. Not just representation, but risk. And in that context, the margin for disagreement narrowed significantly. This is where the friction with Queen Camilla intensified. Because while William's approach was becoming more structured, more strategic, Camilla's position remained consistent. But that consistency now appeared, from his perspective, as resistance. Her encouragement of Charles to remain active, to continue fulfilling duties despite visible fatigue, was not seen by William as support. It was seen as pressure. And pressure, in this context, was unacceptable. What makes this conflict particularly complex is that it is not driven by opposing intentions, but by opposing interpretations of responsibility. Camilla believes that maintaining Charles's visibility reinforces stability. William believes that limiting his exposure preserves both his health and the long-term credibility of the monarchy. Both positions are defensible, but they cannot coexist without tension. And that tension began to surface more clearly in private discussions, where attempts at compromise repeatedly failed to produce alignment. According to individuals familiar with the evolving situation, William's frustration was not expressed through volatility, but through persistence. He did not escalate emotionally. He escalated structurally, raising the issue repeatedly, reframing it, reinforcing it, until it could no longer be dismissed as a difference of opinion. This persistence had an effect. Because over time, it began to influence how others within the institution approached the issue. Advisors, aides, and senior figures who had previously operated within a neutral framework began to recognize that the question of Charles's workload was no longer peripheral, it was central. And once an issue becomes central within a system, it begins to reshape the system itself. This is where the second layer of conflict emerges. Because as William's influence increased, Camilla's position began to face a new kind of pressure. Not direct opposition, but reduced alignment. The informal support that had once reinforced her perspective became less consistent. Not absent, but cautious. And in environments like this, caution is often the first sign of shifting power. At the same time, William's strategic focus expanded beyond immediate scheduling concerns into something more comprehensive. The issue was no longer just how much Charles was doing. It was who was influencing those decisions, and how that influence was structured. And this is where the discussion around associations, relationships, and internal networks became unavoidable. Because within the monarchy, influence does not operate only through official roles. It operates through proximity, through trust, through long-standing relationships that exist outside formal structures. Camilla's network, her connections, her friendships, her extended circle, represented a layer of influence that was not easily quantified, but was undeniably present. For William, this layer introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a system already under pressure, becomes a liability. This is the context in which the reported ultimatum must be understood, not as an isolated demand, but as part of a broader effort to reduce variables that could complicate the monarchy's stability during a critical period. The focus on distancing from figures associated with controversy, particularly those linked to Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, was not simply reputational. It was strategic. Because from William's perspective, the monarchy could no longer afford ambiguity. Every connection would be examined. Every association would be evaluated not just for loyalty, but for impact. Camilla's refusal to fully align with this perspective did not create immediate rupture, but it reinforced the underlying divide. Her position remained grounded in personal loyalty, in relationships that had endured over time and were not easily redefined by external pressure. But within the evolving framework William was constructing, personal loyalty could not override institutional risk. And that is where the conflict becomes structural. Because once the disagreement moves from individual decisions to systemic principles, it can no longer be resolved through negotiation alone. It requires redefinition of roles, of influence, of boundaries. This redefinition did not occur through a single moment. It unfolded gradually, through a series of adjustments that, taken individually, appeared minor, but collectively signaled a shift in control. Meetings were reframed. Discussions were redirected. Decisions began to reflect a different balance of input. And through all of this, one detail remained constant. William was no longer waiting. He was acting. Not as a challenger, not as a disruptor, but as a stabilizer positioning himself ahead of a transition that, in his view, could no longer be left to unfold at its natural pace. This is what makes this moment different from previous internal tensions within the monarchy. It is not reactive. It is preemptive. Because William is not responding to a crisis after it has occurred. He is attempting to prevent one before it becomes unavoidable. And in doing so, he is reshaping not just the outcome of this specific conflict, but the framework through which the monarchy will operate moving forward. Inside Windsor Castle, this reality is understood, even if it is not spoken. Because institutions like this do not announce their transitions. They absorb them. They adjust to them. And then, when the time comes, they present them to the world as if they had always been inevitable. But beneath that presentation lies a more complex truth. That inevitability is constructed. And right now, Prince William is the one constructing it. The moment this situation crossed from controlled tension into open fracture did not happen in public, and it did not arrive with a formal declaration. It happened behind closed doors inside Windsor Castle, in a setting where hierarchy still existed, but where something far more powerful was now asserting itself: momentum. Because by this stage, Prince William was no longer simply influencing the direction of events. He was beginning to define them. And that is where the balance changed. Up until this point, the conflict between William and Queen Camilla had been contained within disagreement, structured, controlled, and managed within the boundaries of royal protocol. But what unfolded next did not fit within those boundaries. It was more direct, more deliberate, and far more revealing of how each of them now viewed the future of the monarchy. Because the issue was no longer just about King Charles III and his workload. It had evolved into a question of authority. Who decides what is acceptable risk? Who defines what stability looks like? And more importantly, who has the right to enforce that definition? This is where William made his move. Not through public pressure, not through institutional channels, but through a direct internal position that carried a level of clarity the palace had not seen from him before. According to those familiar with the internal dynamic, William did not frame his position as a request. He framed it as a line, a boundary, and once defined, it was not open for negotiation. At the center of that boundary was the issue of influence. Specifically, the network of relationships surrounding Camilla that William believed introduced instability into an already fragile environment. This was not about personal dislike. It was about structural risk. And in William's evolving framework for the monarchy, risk was something to be reduced, not managed. The focus of his position extended toward associations that had, over time, become increasingly controversial, particularly those connected to Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. For William, these were not isolated figures operating on the periphery. They represented reputational variables that could, at any moment, re-enter the public narrative and destabilize the carefully maintained image of the institution. And this is where the reported ultimatum takes its full shape. William made it clear that these connections needed to be severed, or at the very least, significantly distanced, from the central structure of the monarchy. Not gradually, not symbolically, but decisively. For him, this was not overreach. It was preparation. Because in his view, waiting until he formally became king to address these issues would be too late. The groundwork for a stable reign needed to be laid now, not after the transition. And that is what made this moment so significant. Because William was no longer operating as an heir anticipating responsibility. He was operating as a leader exercising it. Camilla's response to this shift was equally defining. She did not respond with compliance, and she did not respond with confrontation in the traditional sense. Instead, she held her position, firmly, consistently, and without adjustment. Her relationships, particularly with Sarah Ferguson, were not transactional. They were long-standing, personal, and rooted in a shared history that extended far beyond current controversies. From her perspective, William's demand was not just strategic. It was intrusive. It crossed a line between institutional management and personal autonomy, and that distinction mattered. Because while the monarchy operates as a system, it is still inhabited by individuals whose relationships cannot always be restructured on command. This is where the conflict becomes irreversible. Because once a boundary is set on one side and rejected on the other, the space for compromise collapses. And inside Windsor Castle, that collapse did not produce immediate resolution. It produced separation. Not physical separation, not visible division, but a structural distancing that began to redefine how both sides operated within the same institution. Communication became more formal. Interactions became more measured. The informal channels through which influence once flowed began to close. And in their place, something else emerged. Parallel authority. On one side, King Charles III continued to occupy the formal center of the monarchy, maintaining the role, the title, and the constitutional position that defines the crown. On the other, Prince William began to operate as the functional center, shaping direction, influencing decisions, and positioning himself as the stabilizing force in a system facing multiple layers of pressure. And between those two centers stood Camilla. Not removed, not diminished, but no longer unchallenged. This dual structure is what makes the current moment so unusual. Because the monarchy is designed to operate with a single, clear axis of authority. But what is emerging here is a transition that is not waiting for formal completion. It is unfolding in real time, with influence shifting ahead of title. And that creates tension that cannot remain hidden indefinitely. What intensifies this further is the emotional layer beneath the structural conflict. Because for William, this is not purely strategic. It is personal, shaped by history, by memory, and by a perspective that has been formed over decades. The legacy of Princess Diana is not distant for him. It is active, informing how he interprets loyalty, trust, and the consequences of decisions made within the royal family. And in that context, Camilla is not just a participant in the present conflict. She is part of a past that has never been fully resolved. This does not make his actions impulsive. It makes them layered. Because when strategy and personal history align, the resulting decisions carry a level of conviction that is difficult to redirect. And that conviction is now shaping the future of the monarchy. Inside Windsor Castle, the effects of this shift are already visible to those who understand where to look. Not in public appearances, not in official statements, but in the patterns of influence, in who is consulted, in how decisions are framed, and in the subtle but consistent redefinition of roles. William is no longer positioning himself for a future transition. He is accelerating it, not through declaration, but through action. And that is the critical point. Because once action begins at this level, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It becomes a matter of timing. The question is no longer whether the monarchy will change under Prince William. The question is how much of that change will already be in place by the time he formally wears the crown. And for those still operating within the structure that existed before this shift began, that question carries implications that are only just beginning to surface. What followed that decisive internal fracture was not immediate fallout, not visible confrontation, but something far more consequential: consolidation. Inside Windsor Castle, the monarchy did what it has always done in moments of pressure. It reorganized itself quietly, precisely, and with a clarity that rarely becomes visible to the outside world. But this time, the reorganization carried a different weight, because at its center stood not just King Charles III, but an emerging dual structure where Prince William was no longer operating as a future figure. He was functioning as a present force. The days that followed the ultimatum did not produce dramatic scenes or public signals of division. Instead, they produced something far more telling: patterns. Patterns in access, in communication, in presence. Because within royal systems, power is not always expressed through statements. It is expressed through who is included, who is consulted, and who ultimately shapes the direction of decisions that never appear on official schedules. And within those patterns, one shift became increasingly clear. William's influence was no longer situational. It was structural. What had begun as intervention around his father's health now expanded into a broader framework. One that touched not just scheduling, but governance, optics, and long-term positioning of the monarchy itself. His involvement deepened across internal discussions, not as a participant offering perspective, but as a central figure shaping outcomes. Advisors began to align more closely with his assessments. Strategic conversations began to reflect his priorities. And slowly, without announcement, the gravitational center of decision-making began to move. This is how transitions truly happen. Not at the moment of coronation, but in the months and years before it. And within that shifting center, the role of Queen Camilla began to change. Not through removal, but through redefinition. She was still present, still acknowledged, still performing the duties associated with her position. But presence is not the same as influence. And influence, within the palace, is measured by proximity to decisions. That proximity, gradually, was narrowing. Meetings where her input had once been expected became more selective. Conversations where her perspective had carried weight became more contained. Not excluded entirely, but repositioned. And in an institution built on subtlety, repositioning is often more significant than removal, because it signals direction. At the same time, King Charles III found himself at the intersection of these shifting forces. His role remained formally unchanged, but the environment around him had evolved. The balance between continuity and adaptation, between maintaining authority and enabling transition, required a level of calibration that few monarchs have had to navigate in such real time. What is critical here is that Charles did not resist the shift. He allowed it, not passively, but with awareness. Because the reality he faced was clear. His health, his capacity, and the accelerating pace of public scrutiny meant that the traditional timeline of succession was no longer aligned with the demands of the present. And in that context, William's increasing role was not a challenge. It was a necessity. This alignment between father and son became one of the defining elements of this phase. Their communication, according to those familiar with the internal dynamic, moved beyond formal exchange into strategic coordination. Decisions were no longer isolated. They were shared. The boundary between current authority and future authority began to blur, creating a continuity that would allow the transition, when it came, to feel less like a change and more like a progression already in motion. And alongside this alignment, Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged as a stabilizing force in a way that extended beyond public perception into internal confidence. Her role during this phase was not defined by intervention, but by consistency. At a time when internal dynamics were shifting, her presence remained steady, measured, composed, and aligned with the broader direction William was shaping. She did not need to assert authority. She reflected it. Through tone, through engagement, through an ability to maintain connection with the public while the institution itself adjusted behind closed doors. This balance, between visibility and restraint, became one of the key elements in ensuring that the transition did not translate into uncertainty. Because perception, at this level, is as important as structure. And Catherine understood that instinctively. But while alignment strengthened on one side, distance continued to grow on the other. The relationship between William and Camilla did not collapse into open hostility. It evolved into something more controlled, more formal, and far less flexible. Their interactions became defined by position rather than familiarity. Communication, where necessary, was direct but limited. The informal ease that had once existed, however fragile, was no longer present. This was not conflict in the traditional sense. It was separation of influence. And within Windsor Castle, that separation carried consequences that extended beyond personal dynamics, because it redefined how decisions were shaped. Without a unified internal perspective, the monarchy adapted by consolidating around clarity rather than consensus. Decisions became more streamlined. Priorities became more focused. And within that focus, William's vision of a more controlled, more disciplined, more risk-aware monarchy began to take form. This vision was not theoretical. It was operational. Fewer variables, fewer vulnerabilities, fewer associations that could introduce unpredictability into an institution already navigating multiple layers of scrutiny. And this is where the broader implications of the conflict begin to surface. Because what is happening is not simply a disagreement between individuals. It is a redefinition of how the monarchy will function moving forward. A shift from a system that balances tradition with adaptation to one that prioritizes control, precision, and strategic clarity. William is not waiting to implement that vision. He is already implementing it. And that is what makes this moment so significant. Because by the time the formal transition of power occurs, much of the transformation will already have been completed. The structure will already be in place. The direction will already be set. And the roles of those within the institution will already have been redefined. Inside Windsor Castle, this reality is understood, even if it is not spoken. Because those who operate within the monarchy recognize patterns. They recognize shifts. They recognize when influence changes hands, not through ceremony, but through action. And what they are witnessing now is not preparation. It is execution. The monarchy is not waiting for the future. It is being reshaped in the present. And at the center of that reshaping stands Prince William, not as a successor in waiting, but as a figure already defining what comes next. The final phase of this unfolding power shift did not arrive with a formal announcement or a single defining moment, but with a series of calculated moves that, together, signaled something unmistakable. Inside Windsor Castle, the future of the monarchy was no longer being prepared. It was being executed in real time. And at the center of that execution stood Prince William, operating with a level of authority that no longer waited for the crown to legitimize it. By this stage, the internal structure had already adapted. The resistance that once existed had not exploded. It had dissolved into irrelevance. Queen Camilla was still present, still visible, still performing her duties, but the axis around which decisions now revolved had shifted decisively away from her sphere of influence. This was not removal. It was repositioning. And in a system as precise as the British monarchy, repositioning is often permanent. What makes this moment critical is not simply that William has gained influence, it is how he is using it. Because his approach is not reactive. It is preemptive. Every decision, every adjustment, every subtle restructuring of access and authority points toward a single objective: eliminate uncertainty before it can become instability. This is not the behavior of an heir waiting patiently for succession. This is the behavior of a leader who has determined that waiting itself has become a risk. And that determination is rooted in everything he has witnessed over the past decade. The fallout surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the reputational damage linked to Prince Andrew, the increasing scrutiny placed on every royal decision, and above all, the visible vulnerability of King Charles III during a period of serious illness. These are not isolated events. They are, in William's view, indicators of a system that can no longer afford delayed response. And so, he is not delaying. The implications of this approach extend far beyond the immediate conflict with Camilla. Because what William is constructing is not just a resolution to a specific disagreement, it is a framework for the monarchy he intends to lead. A monarchy that is leaner, more controlled, more insulated from controversy, and far less tolerant of internal divergence that could translate into public weakness. This is where the concept of a slimmed-down monarchy, once associated with gradual reform, takes on a more accelerated and assertive form. Under William's direction, this is not about reducing numbers for efficiency. It is about reducing variables for control. And within that framework, every relationship, every association, every influence channel is subject to evaluation. Not based on tradition, not based on loyalty alone, but based on impact. This is the standard that has brought him into direct conflict with Queen Camilla. Because her position is rooted in a different era of the monarchy, one where relationships, even complicated ones, were managed rather than removed. Where influence was negotiated, not systematically reduced. Where personal history carried weight alongside institutional necessity. But that model is no longer aligned with the direction William is enforcing. And that is why compromise has become increasingly difficult. Because this is not a disagreement about a single decision. It is a divergence in philosophy. And when philosophy diverges at the level of leadership, the outcome is not resolution. It is replacement. Not of individuals, but of systems. Inside Windsor Castle, the effects of this replacement are already visible to those who understand how to read them. The tone of internal discussions has shifted. The pace of decision-making has accelerated. The tolerance for ambiguity has narrowed. And perhaps most significantly, the perception of who holds operational control has begun to change, even if the formal hierarchy has not yet caught up. This creates a situation that is both rare and revealing. A monarchy in which the crown still rests on one head, but the direction of the institution is increasingly shaped by another. And within that structure, King Charles III occupies a position that is both central and transitional. His authority remains intact, but his alignment with William's approach suggests an awareness that the future cannot be delayed indefinitely. His role in this phase is not to resist that future, but to enable it without destabilizing the present. This alignment is what prevents the situation from descending into visible crisis. Because without it, the tension between William and Camilla could easily fracture the institution. But with it, the transition remains controlled, managed, contained. And that containment is what allows the monarchy to project stability, even as its internal structure evolves. For Camilla, the implications are more complex. Her role does not disappear. Her title does not change. But her influence, once derived from proximity to the monarch and the trust that came with it, now exists within a system that is being redefined around a different center. And that center is not hers. It is William's. This does not mean she becomes irrelevant, but it does mean she becomes conditional. Her position, like many others within the evolving structure, will increasingly depend on alignment with the direction being set, not by tradition, but by strategy. And that is the fundamental shift taking place. The monarchy is moving from a system of inherited balance to a system of controlled precision. And William is the one driving that transformation. So as the world watches, waiting for the formal moment when the crown passes from father to son, something far more significant is already happening behind the scenes. The monarchy is not preparing for change. It is undergoing it. Right now. And the question that remains is not whether Prince William will reshape the monarchy when he becomes king. He will. The real question is how much of that transformation will already be complete by the time that moment arrives, and how those within the current structure, particularly Queen Camilla, will navigate a system that is no longer built around the dynamics they once understood. Because in institutions like this, power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply moves. And by the time the world notices, it has already settled into place. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Prince William is right to take control early and reshape the monarchy before the crown officially passes to him? Or is this a dangerous overreach that could create deeper fractures inside the royal family? And what about Queen Camilla? Do you see her as a stabilizing force being pushed aside, or as an obstacle to a more modern, controlled monarchy? If this story gave you a new perspective, make sure you engage, because these conversations don't end here. Share your thoughts below, send this to someone who follows the royal family closely, and subscribe for the next chapter, because inside the palace, this story is far from over.